The chimney smoke was the first thing I saw, a thin gray ribbon, curling into the late afternoon sky, where no one was supposed to be. My horse shifted beneath me as I reined in on the rise, looking down over the valley I'd been riding toward for 3 days. A garden lay in neat rows, where I'd expected only weeds, and a young woman was hanging a blue dress on a clothesline that hadn't been there in any of the deeds or descriptions. She moved like she belonged there, humming soft enough the wind nearly carried it away, her brown hair drawn back in a way that spoke of work, not company. Every mile I'd ridden had been toward a place promised to be mine alone. But the way she stood in that yard told a different story. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever found yourself in a place that turned out to be nothing like what you'd been promised. I was born in the back room of a clapboard house my father built himself in a stretch of country, where the land gave little without hard work. My folks believed a person's word meant more than any paper, that the Sabbath was for rest and neighborly calls, and that you helped fence a pasture or bring in a calf, whether it was yours or not. Money was scarce. But so were debts. We grew what we needed, traded for what we couldn't make, and patched everything until it wouldn't take another stitch. Most of my years were spent driving cattle, mending fences, and sleeping under skies so wide they made a man feel small. That life taught me to travel light and keep my back to the wind. It was a different world in the towns along the rail line, brass-fronted banks, land offices, and men in suits who never set foot past the depot, but made decisions that shaped the lives of folks miles away. I dealt with some of them in cattle contracts, but I'd never expected to be in their hands over land. The homestead I'd bought was meant to be my retreat from all that, a corner of the West where no one knew me and no one would bother coming. The territorial agent in Silver Rock had been quick to push the sale, saying the place had been empty for years, and the price reflected how far it sat from any settlement. I didn't ask too many questions. I just signed, paid, and started the long ride. Now, from the edge of the yard, I could see every board of the house was tended, the garden fence mended, the place kept with a care that didn't happen overnight. My hand went to the folded deed in my coat pocket, the ink still sharp on the page. But as the woman looked up and met my eyes without flinching, I had the sense that my papers wouldn't mean much here. Somewhere behind that calm face was a story, and I had a feeling I was about to hear the part of it that would change everything. The young woman didn't look away, even when I stepped down from the rise and followed the gravel path toward the garden. Dust lifted from my boots in small clouds, settling on the hem of my coat. She set another garment on the line before speaking, her voice steady, almost flat. "You're standing on private property," she said. I pulled the folded deed from my pocket, the paper crackling in my hand. "I believe this property belongs to me," I told her. "Purchased from the territorial office in Silver Rock papers, signed and stamped." She gave the page no more than a glance before meeting my eyes again. "Papers don't mean a thing out here. My family's worked this land longer than any office has been around to sell it." Her name was Clementine Ross, and she spoke it without hesitation when I asked. Her tone held no anger, only the weight of someone stating a fact. She had been born in that house, she said, and she meant to die there if it came to that. I could see the truth of it in the way the place was kept. The garden rose clean and straight, herbs planted in tidy patches, the fence mended with care. It wasn't the wild overgrowth of an abandoned place. It was lived in, guarded. I asked her about the man who'd sold the land. The name Henry Coleman meant nothing to her until I mentioned the territorial office. Then a bitter smile touched her face. "He's the one who came here after my brother disappeared," she said. "Asked questions about the land, about whether we had legal claim. Told me soon enough it wouldn't matter. Her brother Marcus, she explained, had been set to inherit under the law when their father died. But 2 years earlier, Marcus had vanished, and with him gone, the territory declared the land without an heir. That, she said, was how men like Coleman got their hands on places they'd never built." I listened as she told it, the late sun sliding behind the ridge and throwing long shadows over the yard. She spoke of Marcus's curiosity, his habit of riding the passes and keeping watch over who came through. One night he followed riders who moved through after dark. Not traders, not settlers, men with a purpose. He returned shaken, said little of what he'd seen, and 3 days later left to check the northern boundary. His horse came back alone. The saddlebags were still there, the bridle intact. It was as if he vanished into thin air, she said. 2 days after that, Coleman rode in. There was a warning in her voice when she told me some disappearances in these mountains weren't meant to be looked into. I began to understand that my quiet refuge might not be quiet at all. The valley lay hidden from the rest of the world, ringed by high ground and reachable only through narrow passes. If lawless men moved through here, no one beyond these ridges would know or care what happened to those who got in their way. A gust carried the smell of wood smoke, but it was too sharp, too sudden to be from her chimney. She turned toward the sound. At the same moment I heard it. Horses coming through the pass, more than one, their hoofbeats carrying over the hard ground. Clementine's face went pale. "Who knows you're here?" she asked quickly. I told her only Coleman and the clerk at the office had been told. She didn't waste another second. "Then whoever's coming isn't bringing good news." Her hand closed around my arm grip, strong for her size. "Decide now. Mr. Marsh, stand with me, or put your trust in the man who sold you stolen land." I didn't answer with words. I stepped to my saddle, pulled my rifle, and followed her to the porch. The hoofbeats grew louder, steady as a drum. She barred the shutters in practiced motions, her eyes never straying from the window. "They travel in groups when they're moving something they don't want seen," she said. "Cargo?" I asked. "Sometimes stolen goods, sometimes men on the run, sometimes worse." From the narrow gap in the shutter, I watched them ride in 5 men. Their horses well kept their tack clean and oiled. They moved with the order of men who'd done this before. The one in front was tall, his left cheek cut by a pale scar running to his jaw. He swung down at the fence and sent the others to spread out. "Coleman said this place would be empty," he called. A younger rider shifted in the saddle. Maybe the new owner came early. The scarred man's reply made my stomach tighten. The new owner was supposed to be handled. Clementine's whisper was close to my ear. "They're talking about you. Coleman set you up." The truth of it came in cold. I'd been lured here so they could be rid of a witness without anyone asking questions. My first thought was to leave, but Clementine shook her head. "Only one way in or out, and they've got it covered. We're stuck unless we drive them off." The scarred man walked toward the house, one hand easy on the grip of his pistol. "I know someone's inside," he called. "Come out. We'll talk like civilized folks." The tone was too calm, the kind men use when they've already decided the outcome. Clementine moved toward the back, her voice low. "My father built a tunnel from the root cellar to the barn. We might reach the horses if we're quiet." I asked about her home, her belongings. She didn't slow. "This place has cost my family too much already. I won't let it take our lives too." The kitchen boards gave a soft groan when she pulled one up, revealing a dark opening beneath. The air smelled of earth, cool and close. "My father dug this our first winter," she said. Said a man always needed a way out. We dropped into the narrow space, the wooden beams close on both sides. Above us, the front door gave way under a hard shoulder boots pounding across the floorboards. Blake's voice carried through the boards. "Find the woman." Old folks always kept a bolt hole. Clementine froze ahead of me. "They know about the tunnel," she breathed. We moved faster, knees and palms scraping on the rough dirt. I asked how they'd learned. Her answer was quiet and certain. "Marcus. They made him tell before they killed him." The words struck harder than the low ceiling or the fire beginning to crackle at the far end. I could smell kerosene now, the sting of it cutting through the tunnel's still air. Blake's voice came again, closer this time. "Smoke's getting thick down there. Last chance to come up breathing." Clementine's hand traced the wall until she found a point where the earth gave under her fingers. She worked at it, pulling loose a patch of sod to reveal another narrow crawl. Marcus dug this alone. Comes out near the cemetery behind a rock shelf. We might circle around them from there. The fire behind us hissed and popped, drawing closer. I followed her into the even tighter space, dirt falling into my collar as we pushed forward. Ahead, the faintest thread of daylight showed through. We stopped just short of the opening. 2 men stood between us and the line of crosses marking her parents' graves. Their attention shifted between the smoke rising from the barn and the slope behind. Clementine's voice was no louder than the wind in the grass. "One's got a limp, slow to turn, will need a distraction." She pulled a few stones from the packed dirt and sent them skittering toward the fence line. The guards turned toward the sound. "Now," she said. We slipped into the cemetery's cover, the smell of smoke and scorched wood trailing us. From there, I could see the whole yard, the men's positions, and the flames taking the barn. Clementine drew a small leather pouch from her pocket, its drawstring worn smooth. Inside was a folded page covered with writing names, dates, descriptions. Marcus kept record of everything she said. It's enough to bring them all down. She looked toward the pass, eyes narrowing at a sound in the distance. Hoofbeats again, but not the same as before. The kind that meant more men were coming. The sound of the second group of riders carried differently. Not the easy spread of men already in control, but a tighter, more deliberate rhythm. From the cemetery's rocky cover, I could see them break from the timber line, dust rising in a thin veil behind their mounts. Clementine's eyes narrowed. "Those aren't Blake's men," she said. "They're coming in from the north trail." It was a route I hadn't noticed before, screened by a cut in the ridge, one you'd have to know existed to find. The way they sat their saddles and the discipline in their pace told me they weren't drifters. Blake had seen them too. His head came up from where he'd been speaking with a pair of his men near the porch. Whatever calm had been on his face vanished. He barked an order sharp enough to carry. "Kill them both now. They don't reach those riders." The shift was instant, men abandoning their posts. Boots pounding over the dry ground toward our position. The crosses marking Clementine's parents' graves splintered under the first shots, chips of weathered wood flying into the grass. We pressed tighter to the stone monument, grit from shattered rock stinging my cheek. The riders from the north had picked up their pace hooves, striking harder, closing the distance as gunfire cracked across the valley. Clementine kept low, her hand finding my sleeve. "If I fall, you take Marcus's papers to them. Promise me." I shook my head, but her grip only tightened. The pouch with its folded sheet of names and dates was still in her pocket. Its weight a quiet reminder of what we carried. It was more than a list. It was the lever that could pry open the whole rotten structure these men worked under. The air was hot with the smell of burning timber from the barn smoke dragging low across the yard. Blake's men came on fast, their guns drawn, faces hard with the knowledge that lawmen were closing in. A slug tore into the edge of the monument, sending a shard of stone spinning past my ear. I rose just enough to see the marshals now less than 200 yards away. The one in front was broad-shouldered, steel-gray hair catching the last of the sunlight, his rifle steady in the crook of his arm. I stepped out from the cover, voice lifted so it would carry clear over the fight. Marshal Vernon Blake here wanted for murder. In 3 territories. Evidence on Judge Morrison's corruption, my words cut across the noise like a crack of a whip. For a moment, everything slowed. Blake's stride faltered, his men's eyes shifting toward him. The name Morrison wasn't one they'd expected to hear shouted into the open. Whatever protection they'd believed in was suddenly worth less than the cartridges in their belts. "Shoot him!" Blake roared, but the order didn't land the way it had before. The lead marshal fired the round slapping into the dirt a foot from Blake's boots. All weapons down, he called, voice firm and unhurried. "Lay him down, or we fire to kill." The nearest of Blake's men froze, then dropped his revolver to the grass. Another followed. Only two held on, firing wild toward the marshals, before both were brought down with clean, practiced shots. Blake made for his horse, shoving past one of his own. He'd almost reached the saddle when the gray-haired marshal swung his rifle and put a single round through the outlaw's thigh. Blake went down hard, his pistol skittering across the dirt. The marshals moved in fast, binding wrists, disarming the rest. The valley, moments before a knot of heat and noise, began to breathe again. I crossed the short stretch to Clementine and pulled the pouch from her pocket. "He needs to see this," I told her, and she gave a single quick nod. Marshal Samuel Davis listened without interruption as I handed over the folded paper, the writing worn but still clear. His eyes moved down the columns, names of wanted men, dates of shipments, routes through these hills, the link to Judge Morrison spelled out in Marcus's careful hand. "You've just given us the missing piece we've been after for 2 years," Davis said. "This'll bring them all to trial. Coleman, Morrison, and the lot." Clementine stood beside me, her shoulders squared, though I saw the glint of moisture in her eyes. "Then my brother didn't die for nothing," she said quietly. Davis's gaze met hers. "No, ma'am. He saved more lives than he could have known." The marshals set to work gathering weapons, tending the wounded, and sending a pair of riders back up the pass to secure the trail. Blake was lifted onto a wagon, his face ashen, the set of his jaw telling me he understood the rope likely waited for him at the end of this road. The fire in the barn had burned low to embers, the heavy smoke thinning as the evening wind shifted down from the ridge. I helped Clementine gather what little had been disturbed at the cemetery. A tilted cross righted, scattered stones replaced. The yard, the fence, even the porch where we'd first spoken, now looked different with Blake's men gone. The marshals would camp here through the night before taking their prisoners out at first light. Davis promised a formal statement in Silver Rock and that legal ownership of the homestead would be set straight. As the last of the day's light faded, I looked across the valley toward the pass, wondering what else might come through those mountains before this was finished. Marshal Davis and his men stayed the night, their camp set just beyond the barn's blackened frame. The valley felt different with them there. The quiet carried a weight, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Clementine moved through the evening tasks with practiced motions, bringing water from the well, checking on the small livestock that had survived the day's chaos. I helped where I could, my rifle always within reach, though the marshal's presence made a sudden attack unlikely. The prisoners were bound, and under guard, Blake kept on a bedroll near the fire, his leg wound dressed but not coddled. At first light, the marshals began their preparations to ride for Silver Rock. Davis spoke to Clementine just outside the porch, his tone respectful but firm. "We'll see this land restored to you through the proper filings," he said. "The courts will act quickly once this evidence is presented." She gave a single nod, her eyes steady on his. "And Coleman?" she asked. "We'll have him in custody before week's end," Davis assured her. "The judge won't walk free either. Too many names on that list to ignore." The pouch with Marcus's paper was now in Davis's coat, buttoned tight. When they left, the valley settled into a stillness that felt unfamiliar. Without the movement of armed men or the smell of smoke from a burning building, the air seemed cleaner, the sounds sharper. Clementine and I stood by the gate a while, watching the dust of the marshal's departure fade into the pass. She didn't speak, and I didn't press her to. There was work to be done, repairs, clearing debris, putting the place back in order. Over the next days, I came to see how much of the homestead's strength had been built by her own hands. The fence posts along the garden were straight because she dug and set them. The roof shingles that held against the wind were ones she'd cut and laid herself. Each chore was carried out without complaint, her focus always on the task in front of her. I kept to the heavier work, mending the barn doors, hauling lumber from a stand of pine beyond the ridge, replacing a section of corral rail scorched in the fire. In the evenings, we'd sit on the porch while the light faded from the hills. She told me more about Marcus, about the days before his disappearance, when they'd believed this valley would be theirs, without question. He'd been the one to plant the first rows of the garden, to teach her the tunnel routes, to make sure the fences were set against more than cattle. He always said trouble rides faster than good news. She recalled her hands folded in her lap. Now I understand he meant to be ready for it. Midweek, a rider appeared from the north, the same cut in the ridge the marshals had used. His approach was slow, cautious, and Clementine stepped inside for her rifle before he reached the gate. The man dismounted and called out, "Name's Caleb Turner from the county clerk's office." He was older, maybe in his 50s, his face lined from years outdoors. I recognized the seal on the envelope he carried. "Message from Marshal Davis," he said, handing it to me. Inside was a short note in Davis's plain hand, confirming Coleman's arrest and Morrison's removal from the bench, pending trial. It also stated that Coleman's sale of the property had been declared fraudulent and Clementine was recognized as the rightful owner. At the bottom, Davis had added, "Keep watch, friends of these men may still come looking." I passed the letter to her, and she read it without visible reaction, only a slight easing of her shoulders. Turner stayed long enough for a cup of coffee before heading back. As the sound of his horse faded, the valley's quiet returned. That night, the wind shifted from the west, carrying the faint scent of rain from somewhere beyond the ridge. We secured the livestock and stored tools under cover, knowing that wet weather could make the pass impassable for days. The first drops fell before dawn, tapping against the roof in a steady rhythm. By midday, the hills were veiled in low cloud, the kind that muffles every sound. We worked indoors, her sorting stores in the pantry, while I repaired a loose hinge on the cellar door. It was there, with the lantern casting shadows on the stone walls, that she paused in her work and looked toward the far corner. "Marcus kept some things there," she said quietly. Beneath a loose plank, she pulled out a small box. A few photographs, a pocket knife, and a folded map marked with trails I hadn't seen on any survey. "These are the routes he thought they used," she explained. "Some might still be active. If they are there, could be more like Blake's gang moving through." I studied the markings, narrow tracks skirting the ridges. Places where a rider could cross unseen. If the marshals knew about them, they hadn't said. "Davis should have this," I told her, and she agreed, though the look in her eyes said she didn't trust anyone else to keep it safe until then. By the time the rain eased, the ground was slick and the air held that clean scent that comes after a storm. We walked the property together, checking for damage, the mud clinging to our boots. Near the cemetery, I noticed fresh hoof prints in the softened earth, not from our stock and not from Turner's gelding. They came from the west, stopping just inside the fence line before turning back the way they'd come. Clementine crouched to study them, her brow furrowed. "That's not random," she said. "Whoever it was came to look, then left. We followed the tracks until the ground grew too rocky to hold them. Whoever had ridden in knew enough to stay off the main approaches. Back at the house, she kept her rifle closer to hand, and I made sure the barn doors were barred at night. The law might have taken Blake, but the feel of the valley had shifted again, the sense that eyes might be on us from beyond the tree line. Late one afternoon, as the sun dropped low and the shadows stretched long across the yard, a lone rider appeared on the far slope. He didn't approach, only sat his horse for a time, watching. Then, as if satisfied, he turned and vanished into the hills. We said nothing, but both knew it meant the quiet wouldn't hold forever. It was 2 days after the lone rider's appearance when we heard the first unusual sound from the ridge again. The air was still no wind to carry it, but the faint clink of metal reached us, the kind a bridle makes when a horse shifts its head. Clementine was by the garden, and she froze before looking toward me. Without a word, she set down the basket in her hands and crossed to the porch where her rifle leaned. I stepped to the gate, scanning the high line of rock and timber. Nothing moved for a long moment. Then a figure came into view, riding slow, not close enough to be recognized. He stopped just beyond the bend, where the pass widened, his horse shifting under him. After a minute, he turned and disappeared the way he'd come, leaving only the question of why he'd shown himself at all. Clementine's jaw was set as she watched him go. "They're watching," she said. "They want us to know it." That evening, I saddled my gelding and rode to the North Cut, following the same approach the marshals had used. The trail there was narrow and overhung with pine, the kind of path you'd miss unless someone led you to it. A mile beyond the ridge, I found fresh sign, 3 sets of hoof prints, all leading toward the valley. They'd stopped short of entering, circling back the way they'd come. Whoever they were keeping track without getting too close. When I returned, Clementine was at the workbench in the barn, oiling the hinges I'd set for the repaired doors. She listened as I described what I'd seen, her hands never pausing. "They're waiting to see if we're alone," she said. "Waiting to choose their moment." I asked if she thought they were tied to Blake or Coleman. She shook her head. "Could be, or could be someone who used those passes before Blake claimed them." The next morning, we set out on foot to follow one of the routes marked on Marcus's map. The air was cool under the pines, the needles soft under our boots. It took the better part of an hour to reach a narrow shelf of rock where the trail overlooked a dry wash. From there, we could see where the ground bore the marks of repeated crossings, the grooves of wagon wheels, the prints of unshod horses. "This is no hunting trail," I said. Clementine agreed. "No. It's a road for moving goods without the law's eye on it." We made our way back before the light began to fail, both of us aware of how exposed the return felt. At the house, I checked the rifles and made sure the ammunition was within easy reach. She pulled the shutters in before dark, something she'd only done in the worst weather before now. The night passed without incident, but the unease lingered. 2 days later, a man came riding from the south. His horse lathered from a hard run. He wore the badge of a deputy, and I recognized him from Silver Rock, though we'd never spoken. "Name's Deputy Warren Holt," he said, dismounting at the gate. "Marshal Davis sent me. Thought you should know Coleman's friends aren't taking his arrest kindly. There's talk of them hiring hands to make trouble before the trial." Clementine's expression didn't change, but her hand tightened on the gatepost. Holt added, "Marshal says keep to the house when you can, and keep your powder dry." We offered him coffee before he left, and he took it standing just inside the porch's shade. He asked a few questions about riders we'd seen, and when we mentioned the man on the ridge, he nodded slowly. "Could be they're gauging how strong you are out here." He finished his cup, set it on the rail, and swung back into the saddle. "If you see them again, don't wait. Send word to Silver Rock." Then he was gone, his horse carrying him west toward the town. The hours after his visit stretched long. Clementine spent them in the garden, hands in the soil, while I split wood and listened for sounds beyond the fence. The quiet was heavier now, as though the valley itself was bracing. Near sundown, I saw her glance toward the ridge more than once. As the last light faded, we sat on the porch, neither speaking until the sound of a horse came again, this time from the south trail, steady and unhurried. The rider came into view as the first stars showed. He was dressed plainly, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a rifle in a scabbard under his leg. He stopped at the gate, looked from me to Clementine, and said, "Evening." His voice carried the flat tone of someone not looking for talk. "Name's Elias Ward. I've been sent with a message you'll want to hear." He reached into his coat, pulled out a sealed envelope, and handed it over. "From Silver Rock," he said. "Instructions inside." He tipped his hat, turned his horse without another word, and rode back into the dark, leaving the envelope heavy in my hand. I could feel the grit of dust on the paper where it had ridden against his coat. The wax seal bore the mark of the territorial court. I looked at Clementine, and she looked back, the unspoken thought between us. Clear whatever was inside would change what we had to do next. I broke the wax seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. The writing was Marshal Davis's short, clear, and to the point. Coleman's allies had been seen moving between towns in the territory, and word from his sources was that they meant to stop Clementine from testifying. The note included a name, Silas Rourke, a hired man known for tracking witnesses before trials. Davis warned he'd likely come alone at first to learn our routines, then bring others if he thought the risk worth it. Clementine read over my shoulder, her expression fixed. "If Davis is right, the watching we've felt isn't just curiosity," she said. "We both knew the rider on the ridge could have been Rourke." That night we checked every shutter, made sure the rifles were loaded, and kept the lanterns low. The wind carried the smell of juniper and the faint sound of coyotes calling from the far hills, but otherwise, the valley lay silent. The next day, I worked on the corral fence while Clementine tended the garden. Around mid-afternoon, I caught movement at the edge of the pines near the northern trail, a flicker of light on metal. I kept my head down and worked the post-hole digger as if I hadn't noticed. When I glanced up again, the glint was gone. An hour later, I found fresh boot tracks in the soft dirt beyond the fence line. They didn't match mine or Clementine's, the heel worn at an angle, stride long and steady. That evening, we brought the livestock in early. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls' ears, flicking at sounds I couldn't hear. I saddled my gelding after supper and rode the northern cut in a wide loop, keeping to the high ground. Near a rocky outcrop, I found where someone had knelt, grass pressed flat, a vantage point with a clear view of the house and yard. Whoever it was had been close enough to watch us without risk of being seen. When I returned, Clementine had the map. Marcus left spread on the kitchen table. "If he's been here, he knows the main approaches," she said. "But this one," she tapped a narrow trail that skirted the west ridge. "This is harder to watch from a distance. It might give us the chance to turn the tables." We talked it through, agreeing that if the watcher returned, we'd follow him by that western trail and see where he made camp. 2 mornings later, the chance came. Just after sunrise, Clementine spotted a figure on the far slope glassing the house with a spyglass. He stayed longer than before, moving only to shift his footing. We gave him time, then I saddled the gelding, riding slow in the opposite direction, before cutting into the ridgeline and circling back along the marked trail. Clementine stayed behind to keep the routine looking normal. The plan worked. By the time I reached the crest above the slope, the man was making his way through a narrow draw leading his horse. His coat was worn but well kept, a rifle tied to the saddle. He moved with the ease of someone who knew the country, but he didn't know he was being shadowed. I kept my distance until he reached a small camp hidden in a stand of cedar, a bedroll, a small fire pit, and a pack mule loaded with supplies, enough for a week or more. I rode back the long way and told Clementine what I'd seen. "That's not a casual look around," I said. "He's here for as long as it takes." We agreed not to confront him outright. Better to let Davis know and see if the marshals could move faster. I wrote a brief note and sealed it. Then, before dawn the next day, I rode hard for the telegraph station in Silver Rock. The operator, an older man named Virgil Coates, knew to keep things quiet. He sent the wire with only a nod and no questions. I waited long enough for a reply, which came just after midday. Davis would send 2 men within the week, but until then, we were to keep watch and avoid a direct fight if possible. Back at the valley, Clementine met me at the gate with news. "He's been closer," she said. I found where he stood by the south fence. Tracks lead back toward the cedars. The thought of him moving freely around the property while we were away from parts of it put both of us on edge. That night we took turns at the upstairs window, watching the yard and the dark beyond the fence. 3 nights later, near midnight, a low whistle cut through the stillness, 2 notes short and sharp from somewhere near the barn. We stayed inside listening. The sound didn't come again, but in the morning we found the barn door latch unhooked, though we'd fastened it the evening before. Nothing was taken, but it was a clear message he could get close. That was when Clementine decided we wouldn't wait for the marshals to bring the fight to him. "If he's still camped by those cedars tomorrow, we're going to see who he is," she said. Her voice was steady, her eyes clear. I knew better than to argue. We spent the rest of the day readying our horses and packing light gear. The plan was simple approach, from the west stay under cover until we could get close enough to see his face and, if possible, force a talk. As the sun set, the sky turning the ridgeline to black against deep red, I checked the rifle one last time. The air was cooling fast, the scent of pine and dust mixing in the evening breeze. We didn't speak much that night, the quiet holding all the things we knew might come with the morning. We started before first light, the horse's breath showing white in the cold air. The trail to the west ridge was quiet, the pines closing in on both sides, the ground soft with needles that muffled the sound of hoofbeats. Clementine rode ahead, keeping to the shadows, her rifle slung but ready. We moved slow, making sure to stay out of sight from any rise that overlooked the valley. By mid-morning, we reached the edge of the cedar stand where I'd seen the camp. We left the horses tied in a hollow and went the rest of the way on foot. The air smelled faintly of smoke, old, but not stale. Whoever was camped here had kept the fire low. Through the trees, we caught sight of the same bedroll, the same mule tied to a branch, and a man crouched over a small tin pot pouring coffee. He was tall, with a heavy coat and a dark beard, streaked with gray. A rifle leaned within reach. Clementine motioned for me to hold back. She stepped into the clearing as though she'd come to trade her voice even. "Morning?" The man didn't startle. He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly, then glanced past her toward the cedars where I stood. "You can come out too," he said. No sense pretending. I stepped forward, keeping my hands where he could see them, but staying close enough to my sidearm. He introduced himself as Silas Rourke, without prompting, his voice low, almost measured. "I'm here for Coleman's sake," he said plainly. "You're trouble for men who pay me well, but they've got their own troubles now." He told us the truth of it, that with Blake dead and Coleman in custody, the network was fraying. The men who might have come for us were looking to save themselves instead. "Doesn't mean you're safe," he added. "It just means no one's been paid to do the job yet." Clementine studied him for a long moment. "And you here to finish what they started?" Rourke shook his head. "Not today, maybe not ever. But I don't work for free." He nodded toward Marcus's name when she mentioned her brother said he'd heard of him before things went bad. Word was he had enough written down to hang more than one judge. Now I know that was true. It was clear he wasn't a man to be trusted, but he also wasn't hiding his intentions. He told us there were others watching the valley from the eastern pass, men without his restraint. "You've got days, maybe less, before they get restless," he warned. If I were you, I'd be ready to move, or ready to fight. We left without giving him any answer, returning to the horses and riding the long way back to the valley. Neither of us spoke until the house came into view. Clementine's grip tightened on the reins. "He's not done with us," she said. I agreed. Whether he came himself or sent word to others, his camp in those cedars meant this wasn't over. That night we laid out ammunition and double-checked the shutters. The moon rose pale over the ridge, lighting the yard enough to see across to the fence line. Twice I thought I caught movement near the far gate, but nothing stayed in view. The air was still, and every creak of the house felt sharper. At dawn I walked the fence and found another set of boot tracks in the same place we'd seen before, only this time they led closer to the barn before turning back. There was no sign of the man himself, but his presence was in every mark on the ground. Clementine came to stand beside me, looking out toward the pass. "If Davis's men don't come soon," she said quietly, "we'll have to make our own plan." The day passed in slow work, her mending harness leather at the porch, me repairing a loose board in the corral. Every so often I'd scan the ridge lines, half expecting to see the shape of a rider watching. Near sundown, the shadows stretched long, and the sky deepened into the colors that come just before full dark. That was when a lone figure appeared on the northern trail, riding steady toward the house. We stood side by side as the rider approached the creak of saddle leather carrying in the cool air. He stopped short of the gate, lifted a hand in greeting, and called out that he had news from Silver Rock. His voice was unfamiliar, but the way he sat, his horse showed he'd come far without stopping. He reached into his coat and pulled a folded paper, holding it out over the gate. "Straight from Marshal Davis," he said. I took it without a word, the paper still warm from being close to his body. The rider tipped his hat and turned back toward the trail without waiting for a reply. As his horse's hoofbeats faded into the distance, Clementine looked at me. We both knew whatever was written inside would decide our next move. I broke the seal and read Marshal Davis's message under the fading light. His men were on their way, but they'd already caught wind of Silas Rourke's presence in the cedar stand. Davis's words were clear, hold fast, and when his deputies arrived, they'd escort Rourke back to Silver Rock to answer for the charges he'd run from in other counties. He ended with one last line. "You've done more than survive this. You've brought to light what was meant to stay hidden." Clementine stood beside me, her arms folded, watching my face as I read. When I handed her the paper, she didn't speak right away. Then she nodded once. "It ends here, then?" There was no bravado in her tone, only the kind of certainty that comes when a fight is nearly done. 2 days later, Davis rode in with 3 deputies. The valley seemed to ease with their arrival. They went straight to the cedar stand, and before the sun was high, they brought Rourke down the trail in irons. He didn't look surprised to see us waiting by the gate. Davis handed over a small ledger taken from Rourke's camp. More names, more evidence tying Coleman's circle to their hidden roots. "This," he said, patting the worn cover, "will shut every one of those passes for good." In the weeks that followed, the trials in Silver Rock became the talk of every trading post and depot from here to the county line. Coleman was convicted on every count. Judge Morrison lost the bench and his freedom in the same day. Rourke took a deal that saw him behind bars for a long time, but not before swearing he'd never ride this valley again. The passes went quiet after that. No midnight riders, no shadowed figures on the ridge. Life settled back into its proper rhythm. Fences got mended, the barn stood straight and solid again, and the garden flourished under Clementine's hand. The sound of a horse on the trail meant a neighbor coming by, not a threat at our door. One evening, sitting on the porch with coffee in hand, Clementine looked over at me and asked if I planned to keep on toward the solitude I'd been chasing when I first bought this place. I told her I reckoned I'd already found what I was looking for. I stayed. We rebuilt not just the homestead, but the quiet trust between us that had been forged in those weeks of watching every shadow. The valley no longer felt like a place to hide, it felt like a place to belong. Sometimes when the light fades just so, and the hills turn blue against the sky, I think about the trail that brought me here. Justice came in its own time. But it came because someone had the grit to stand their ground and the courage to trust another to stand with them. Out here, that's worth more than any deed or title. If you've ever held on when it would have been easier to let go, you know the truth of it. And if this story's found a place in you, I hope you'll share it. Someone out there might be waiting to hear it.